Just imagine that for a second. You're a German soldier on the Eastern Front. It's chaos. And then you see them. Dogs running right for your tank. But they're not attacking. Their tails are wagging. This single haunting image from the war captures one of its most bizarre and tragic stories. Let's unpack the unbelievable tale of the Soviet Union's anti-tank dog program.
To really get our heads around how anyone could come up with this idea, we have to travel back to 1941. This was a moment of pure, absolute crisis for the Soviet Union. They were facing annihilation, and they were willing to try anything, no matter how desperate or unthinkable it seemed.
In June of '41, Operation Barbarossa hit the Soviet Union like a tidal wave. The German Blitzkrieg, their lightning war, was just devastating. Panzer divisions were tearing through Soviet lines at a terrifying speed. By the fall, they were literally on the doorstep of Moscow. The Red Army was breaking. And here's the heart of the problem. They were completely outmatched when it came to technology. The Soviets just didn't have enough effective anti-tank weapons, not enough guns, not enough cannons to stop what felt like an endless flood of German steel. They needed a solution, any solution, and they needed it yesterday.
Well, this kind of desperation is exactly what gives birth to something military experts call asymmetric warfare. It's a simple concept, really. When you can't match your enemy tank for tank or plane for plane, you get creative. You look for strange, unconventional ways to hit them where they're weak. And for the Soviets, that meant looking to man's best friend. The plan they came up with was, well, it was chillingly logical. It was basically a twisted application of the work of the famous Russian scientist Ivan Pavlov. They figured they could use his ideas about conditioning to weaponize a dog's most powerful instincts. The entire program was built on one simple, brutal idea: starvation. The trainers kept the dogs constantly hungry. That way, they could condition them to associate the one thing they desperately wanted, food, with the one thing the Red Army desperately needed to destroy, an enemy tank. It was a pretty methodical process. First, they taught the hungry dogs to find food underneath a tank that was just sitting there, silent. Easy enough. Then they started turning the engines on, so the dogs had to get used to the loud noise and the shaking ground to get their meal. And finally, they simulated a battle, tanks moving, blank rounds firing, explosions going off, all to train the dogs to ignore the chaos and just focus on that one goal: get under the tank. You know, what's really wild is that this wasn't even supposed to be a suicide mission at first. The original idea was way more complicated. A dog would run under a tank, pull a strop with its teeth to drop off a bomb with a timer, and then run back to its handler. But that just didn't work. The dogs got confused, they'd come back still carrying the live bomb. It was a disaster. So they simplified it. It became a one-way trip. So the final weapon was brutally simple. They fitted each dog with a canvas harness carrying about 25 pounds of high explosives. And the trigger mechanism? Just a little wooden lever that stuck up from the dog's back. The idea was, when the dog ran under the low-slung body of a tank, the lever would get pushed back. And boom. On paper, it must have seemed like a genius plan. The science was there, the engineering was simple. But here's the thing: the real world, the battlefield, is not a clean, controlled laboratory. And when they finally deployed these living mines, they discovered a single, catastrophic flaw that they had totally missed. Their first big test came during the desperate defense of Moscow in 1941. And it was an absolute, unmitigated catastrophe. They sent out 30 dogs. Most of them just panicked in the sheer terror of a real battle. But worse, 6 of them got scared, turned around, and ran back to the only safety they knew: the Soviet trenches. They exploded right there, killing the very soldiers who had sent them out. So you have to be asking, what on earth went wrong? The training was so specific. The conditioning should have worked perfectly. Why would these loyal animals, literally trained to see tanks as their source of food, turn back and become a deadly threat to their own side? The answer wasn't a failure of training or courage. It was biology. It was something they couldn't see, but the dogs could definitely smell. See, they trained the dogs using Soviet tanks like the T-34, which all ran on diesel engines. But the German panzers they were supposed to attack, they ran on gasoline. For a dog's incredible sense of smell, that's like the difference between a kitchen and a chemical plant. And that is the absolute tragedy of it all. In the confusion and terror of battle, the dogs didn't go for the strange, threatening smell of the enemy. They sought out what was familiar. They sought out the smell their training had taught them meant food and safety, the smell of diesel.
They ran towards their own Soviet tanks. This one fatal flaw had horrifying consequences. And not just for the dogs, but for the soldiers on both sides of the front line, and for the entire strategy behind the program. The Germans, for their part, took this threat very seriously. They even gave it a name, Hundemähnen, or dog mines. An order went out to every German soldier on the Eastern Front: shoot any and every dog you see in a combat zone. No questions asked. This weapon, designed to stop tanks, ended up making the battlefield a death sentence for any dog, military or not. And the scale of this was just immense. We're talking about roughly 40,000 dogs that the Soviet Union enlisted for military duty during the war. Now, not all of them were anti-tank dogs, of course, but a huge number were pulled from shelters and homes for exactly this purpose. But maybe the deepest, most gut-wrenching cost of this whole program was the psychological toll it took on the Soviet handlers. I mean, these soldiers spent months training, feeding, and bonding with these animals. They formed real attachments. And then they were ordered to send their friends on a one-way mission. And if a terrified dog ran back towards them, it was often the handler who had to shoot it to protect his own comrades. It's just unimaginable. So, you might think that was the end of the story, a total tragic failure. But it's actually a bit more complicated than that. The legacy of these dogs didn't just end there in failure and friendly fire. So, did the program work at all? Well, that really depends on who you ask. Official Soviet propaganda claimed the dogs took out around 300 German tanks. That's almost certainly inflated. Western historians think the number is closer to maybe 50 or at most 100. The Germans mostly considered them a nuisance. But there were documented cases where they did work, especially in the brutal close-quarters fighting at Stalingrad and the massive tank battle of Kursk. By 1943, the Soviets were getting better anti-tank weapons, and the program's failures were obvious, so its use was drastically cut back. But here's where the story takes a positive turn. The surviving dogs weren't just abandoned. They were retrained for new jobs they were brilliant at. As mine detection dogs, they were heroes, finding an estimated 4 million landmines and saving countless human lives. And that brings us right back to where we started. In 2011, in the city of Volgograd, the city that was once Stalingrad, this monument went up. It's a permanent bronze tribute to the loyalty and the unbelievable sacrifice of these animals, a lasting reminder of the sheer desperation of war. So it leaves us with a really tough question, doesn't it? In a total war, a war for the very survival of your nation, is anything and everything justified? Or does weaponizing the trust and loyalty of an animal cross a moral line that should never, ever be crossed, no matter how desperate things get? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'd love to hear your thoughts on that question in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please give this a like and subscribe to the channel for more explorations into forgotten history.